Imagine a world broken and scarred by conflict, a world where nations lay in ruins, and the very idea of peace seemed like a distant dream. This was Europe after the Great War. In this landscape of devastation, a fragile democracy in Germany teetered on the brink of collapse. But from these ashes, a new dark force began to rise, a force fueled by a potent mix of hatred, fear, and an insatiable ambition. In a climate of deep hopelessness and despair, one man emerged, offering a different path, a man named Adolf Hitler. Hitler promised a radical idea: make Germany great again. While millions struggled just to survive, he spoke of national pride, of reclaiming lost glory. He understood, like few others, how to tap into the raw emotions of a suffering population. He was a master of his craft, a conductor with an orchestra, able to sway thousands with his words. This is the story of how one man's vision, twisted and consumed by darkness, led to the rise of the Third Reich and the world's descent into unimaginable chaos. To understand the man who would shape the 20th century, we must look at his beginnings. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria. His father, Alois, was 52 years old when Adolf was born, a significant age gap compared to his mother, Clara, who was much younger. This age difference meant Adolf was exceptionally close to his mother, who doted on him. Some historians suggest Clara's over-attentiveness, possibly a response to her own unhappy marriage and the earlier loss of 3 infant children, created an environment where young Adolf felt exceptionally cherished, perhaps even indulged. However, his childhood was far from idyllic. His father, Alois, was a complex and often harsh figure. A former customs official who rose through the ranks, Alois was known for his authoritarianism, strictness, and frequent temper outbursts. He demanded absolute obedience and was not hesitant to use physical discipline, often beating young Adolf for perceived transgressions. This physical abuse, combined with Alois's generally distant and unapproachable demeanor, likely fostered a deep-seated resentment and fear in young Adolf. Adolf's sister Paula later recalled how their father was a hard and difficult man who set a pattern for Adolf's own brutal view of life. While his father was a source of fear, his mother, Clara, was a source of comfort and affection. She considered Adolf her favorite child, often calling him her darling. She would try to shield him from his father's rages and indulged his whims, even supporting his early artistic aspirations. This deep, perhaps Oedipal bond with his mother, combined with the severe paternal treatment, may have contributed to his later psychological makeup, creating a complex emotional foundation. As Adolf grew, his education began to shape his worldview. A particularly influential figure was his history teacher, Leopold Putsch, at the Linz Realschule. Putsch was a fervent nationalist, deeply critical of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the ruling Habsburg dynasty, which he believed betrayed the German people. He preached the idea of a greater Germany, where all ethnic Germans should be united under one government, and openly expressed racist views, labeling Jews and Slavs as inferior races. Hitler later recalled Putsch with gentle emotion, acknowledging how the teacher's dazzling eloquence and passionate narratives made history come alive. Putsch actively used Hitler's budding nationalistic fanaticism as an educational tool, appealing to his sense of national honor. This immersion in fervent German nationalism and racial ideology, delivered by a respected authority figure, profoundly impacted the adolescent Hitler, planting the seeds for his later political convictions and his view of history as a struggle for national dominance. These early influences, the complex family life, the stern father, the doting mother, and the fervent nationalist teacher, all helped shape the young Adolf Hitler. But it was the crucible of war that would truly forge the man who would lead Germany into a new, terrifying era. At just 25 years old, Adolf Hitler was thrust into the cataclysm of World War I. The conflict, which erupted in 1914, plunged Europe into unprecedented violence. shattering old empires and ushering in an era of brutal, modern warfare. Unlike many men who had military experience, Hitler, having previously failed to gain admission to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, enlisted in the Bavarian army in August 1914. This was his first taste of military life, a stark departure from his artistic aspirations. Hitler served as a Meldegänger, or dispatch runner, on the Western Front. This was an incredibly dangerous role, requiring him to carry vital messages between command posts, often through shell-torn landscapes and under heavy artillery fire. He experienced firsthand the sheer terror and brutality of battles like the Somme and Verdun. Witnessing the constant exposure to death and destruction, his bravery in delivering messages under fire earned him recognition. He was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914. Later, in 1918, he received the more prestigious Iron Cross First Class, a distinction rarely given to someone of his rank, highlighting his exceptional performance in perilous situations. In October 1918, Hitler was caught in a British gas attack near Ypres. The mustard gas blinded him temporarily, plunging him into darkness and pain. The experience was profoundly traumatic, leaving him hospitalized for weeks. But upon recovering his sight, he felt a profound, almost mystical change. He believed he had been spared, that he had survived for a reason, that he was destined for a special mission in life. The war, with its intense suffering and the stark reality of death, had transformed him. It had taken the restless young man and forged him into someone with a burning, unshakable conviction. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Germany was left utterly defeated and humiliated. The nation felt betrayed, exhausted after 4 years of relentless fighting that had cost millions of lives with no clear victory. The war had not only destroyed lives, but also shattered the social and political fabric of the nation. The abdication of the Kaiser and the collapse of the empire created a vacuum, leaving Germany in a state of deep unrest, instability, and on the verge of collapse. For Hitler, the war was a defining period he would later romanticize. He often spoke of the trenches with a sense of camaraderie and purpose, viewing it as a pure experience of national struggle, a stark contrast to the perceived weakness and moral decay of post-war Germany. He became part of what is often called the lost generation, young men who found civilian life jarring after the intensity and clear objectives of the battlefield, clinging to their wartime experiences as the peak of their lives. This profound nostalgia and the lingering trauma of war, both personal and national, would deeply influence his future actions and his fervent desire to restore Germany to a perceived former glory. Hitler emerged from the war transformed, convinced he had a destiny, but the Germany he returned to was a nation shattered, defeated, and deeply humiliated by the very peace that ended the fighting. The seeds of resentment sown by the war would soon be watered by the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Germany was left utterly defeated and humiliated. But the true weight of this defeat was solidified in 1919 with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, negotiated primarily by the Big Four Allied leaders, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. The treaty imposed harsh terms on a prostrate Germany. Germany was stripped of significant territories. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Land was ceded to newly formed Poland, creating the controversial Polish Corridor, and all overseas colonies were confiscated. Furthermore, its military was brutally restricted. The army capped at just 100,000 men, conscription abolished, no air force, no tanks, no heavy artillery, and the vital Rhineland region declared a demilitarized zone. These were not just political adjustments. They were deep wounds to national pride and sovereignty. The most infamous clause was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It declared Germany and its allies solely responsible for the war. This was seen by Germans not only as a moral lie, but also as the legal justification for exorbitant reparations. The initial sum demanded, an astronomical amount that crippled the already fragile economy and led to hyperinflation, where people needed wheelbarrows full of money for basic necessities. This economic devastation wasn't accidental. It was exacerbated by the government's decision to print money to finance passive resistance when the French occupied the Ruhr industrial region in 1923, effectively destroying the savings of the middle class and eroding their sense of security and faith in the democratic system. The Weimar Republic, Germany's new liberal democracy, struggled to cope. It faced constant threats from both communist uprisings on the left, like the Spartacist uprising in 1919, and right-wing paramilitary groups. The frequent changes in government and the inability to provide stability meant that the system itself became an easy target for blame. It appeared weak, indecisive, and incapable of protecting its citizens or its national interests. It was into this vacuum of despair and resentment that Adolf Hitler stepped, a master manipulator of grievance. He expertly linked the humiliation of Versailles, the economic collapse, and the political instability to his scapegoats: Jews, communists, and the politicians who signed the armistice, the November criminals. He propagated the powerful stab-in-the-back myth, a narrative that absolved the German army of defeat and blamed internal enemies. Hitler didn't just identify the problems, he offered a compelling vision of restoration, promising to tear up the hated treaty, rebuild the economy, and restore Germany's lost glory and national pride, directly addressing the deepest wounds inflicted upon the nation. This environment of profound national humiliation, economic despair, and political instability created a fertile ground for radical ideas. Into this vacuum stepped a man who understood the power of words and the art of manipulation, Adolf Hitler, who would soon take center stage as a master demagogue. In July 1919, a crucial opportunity arose. Hitler was appointed as an intelligence agent for the German army, tasked with observing political groups, particularly those expressing nationalist and anti-Semitic sentiments, groups the army saw as potentially useful or dangerous. His assignment led him to the German Workers' Party, DAP, a small fringe nationalist movement. Within 2 years, by July 1921, Adolf Hitler, already demonstrating a remarkable talent for persuasion, became its leader. He quickly transformed the party, renaming it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP. He established a formidable paramilitary wing, the SA, Sturmabteilung, or Stormtroopers. The SA wasn't just for defense. Their marches, uniforms, and intimidating presence at rallies helped create an atmosphere of order and strength, making the Nazi Party appear dominant and capable of enforcing its will. He also secured the party's own newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, a crucial organ for shaping its message and reaching a wider audience. Hitler's initial role was propaganda, a function he embraced with genius. He was a natural orator, a demagogue who could connect with the masses on a visceral level. His speeches were vitriolic, powerful, and incredibly effective, attracting huge, regular audiences. He masterfully used repetition, rhetorical questions, dramatic pauses, and projected an unwavering conviction that captivated listeners. He continuously reinforced the stab-in-the-back myth, linking it directly to the internal enemies he identified. He understood that in times of economic hardship and national pain, people craved simple explanations and strong leadership. He provided both by blaming specific groups, Jews, Marxists, and the perceived weak politicians of the Weimar Republic, for Germany's woes. His rhetoric appealed to raw emotions, anger at the injustice of Versailles, fear of communist takeover, and a deep longing for national pride and economic recovery. His speeches were a performance, a psychological spectacle that bypassed rational debate and aimed straight for the heart of the audience's grievances and hopes. His charisma was immense. He possessed a personal magnetism and an uncanny understanding of crowd psychology, a skill often described as hypnotic. He could read his audience perfectly, adapting his message and tone to resonate deeply, playing on their fears and desires. Nazi rallies were meticulously orchestrated events, designed to create an overwhelming atmosphere of unity, power, and absolute conviction. The banners, the uniforms, the music, the precise timing, all contributed to a powerful psychological impact that drew people into Hitler's radical vision. Listeners felt he understood their suffering and offered real solutions, making the Nazi Party, through Hitler's captivating performances, a serious political contender. Hitler's electrifying speeches and growing popularity began to transform the Nazi Party, but he grew impatient with the slow pace of change. Inspired by events in Italy, he believed a bold, decisive strike was needed to seize power, leading him to attempt a dramatic, albeit failed coup. By 1923, Adolf Hitler was growing impatient. He believed the Weimar Republic, weakened by economic turmoil and political infighting, was ripe for collapse. He was particularly inspired by Benito Mussolini's successful March on Rome the previous year, seeing it as a powerful blueprint for seizing power through force and intimidation. Hitler envisioned the Putsch not just as a Bavarian uprising, but as the spark for a nationwide national revolution to overthrow the government in Berlin. The more conservative and nationalist climate in Bavaria also made it seem like a promising starting point. On November 8, 1923, Hitler put his plan into action. He stormed into the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall in Munich during a meeting of Bavarian state leaders, including Gustav von Kahr. Firing a pistol into the ceiling, he declared the meeting dissolved and the government deposed. He then coerced the leaders, under threat of immediate violence, into supporting his coup and declaring a new provisional government. He even convinced the revered World War I hero, General Erich Ludendorff, to lend his name and credibility to the cause, hoping it would rally the army and conservatives. However, the moment Hitler and his followers left the beer hall to begin their march on Munich, the coerced leaders reneged on their promises, alerted the police, and tipped off the army. The march, meant to be an overwhelming display of power, quickly turned into a confrontation. Bavarian police, loyal to the government, set up barricades. A fierce, though brief gun battle ensued. Hermann Göring was wounded, several Nazis and police officers were killed, and Hitler himself dislocated his shoulder while being hurried away by his security detail. The coup had failed. Hitler was arrested a few days later and put on trial for treason. But the trial became his unintended platform. Instead of showing remorse, Hitler used the courtroom as a stage to deliver impassioned speeches, portraying himself not as a traitor, but as a patriot defending Germany against a corrupt system. He skillfully manipulated the proceedings, garnering significant public sympathy and national attention. The judges, perhaps influenced by his rhetoric or the prevailing political climate, handed down a lenient sentence. 5 years in Landsberg prison. He would serve only about 9 months. While the beer hall putsch was a tactical failure, the trial inadvertently elevated Hitler's profile from a regional agitator to a national figure. His defiant stand and eloquent defense created a sense of martyrdom for his cause, a dramatic new chapter in his rise to power. The failed coup, in a twist of fate, had given him the very platform he needed to reach a wider audience and solidify his image as a leader, willing to fight for Germany's destiny. What do you think was the most critical moment in Hitler's early political career? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Though the beer hall putsch failed, Hitler's trial gave him a national platform. While imprisoned, he didn't abandon his ambitions. Instead, he formalized his radical ideology and began the crucial task of rebuilding his party, shifting strategy from violent overthrow to a more insidious plan for legal seizure of power. Sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison for his role in the failed beer hall putsch, Adolf Hitler found himself temporarily removed from the political arena. However, he used this time not for reflection on his actions, but to formalize his radical ideology and plan his party's resurgence. Here, he dictated his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, primarily to Rudolf Hess, who transcribed his words. Mein Kampf was far more than a memoir. It was a detailed blueprint for the Nazi state and Hitler's vision for Germany. In its pages, he laid out his virulent racial theories, believing in an Aryan master race, and promoting a pseudo-scientific anti-Semitism that equated Jews with a parasitic disease that must be eradicated to protect the Aryan ideal. He espoused his concept of Lebensraum, or living space, arguing that Germany needed to conquer territory in Eastern Europe, displacing or eliminating inferior Slavic populations. His hatred for communism was intertwined with his anti-Semitism, viewing both as existential threats. Crucially, he expressed his profound contempt for democracy and parliamentarism, advocating for a totalitarian state led by an absolute leader, the Führer. This was the core of the Führerprinzip, the idea of unquestioned, absolute leadership. Upon his early release, Hitler embarked on a strategic pivot. He realized that seizing power through immediate violent revolution was not feasible. Instead, he resolved to gain power legally by dismantling the democratic system from within. He refounded the Nazi Party, reorganizing it with a strict hierarchy and professionalizing its operations. Propaganda became its primary weapon, a sophisticated tool for mass mobilization and persuasion, rather than just overt violence, though the essay remained to intimidate opponents. The party began to broaden its appeal, actively seeking to attract workers and the middle class by addressing their specific grievances and offering simple, decisive solutions. Hitler's image was meticulously cultivated as the sole savior of Germany. His charismatic performances at rallies, honed by experience, became the focal point of the party's appeal. Mein Kampf served as the ideological Bible for the Nazi movement, and in many ways solidified Hitler's own fervent belief in his unique destiny and mission to restore Germany. The ideas laid out in this book would directly inform the horrific policies of the Third Reich. With his ideology codified in Mein Kampf and the Nazi Party reorganized for mass appeal, Hitler was poised for growth. His opportunity came with devastating force in 1929, as a global economic catastrophe swept the world, creating the perfect storm for his radical promises to take root. Then, in October 1929, the global economic order shattered. The Wall Street crash in the United States triggered the Great Depression, a worldwide economic catastrophe that plunged nations into unprecedented hardship. The shock was immediate and severe. Economies worldwide collapsed as American banks recalled loans, devastating countries like Germany that were heavily reliant on them. This wasn't just a financial downturn, it was a human crisis, marked by mass unemployment, widespread poverty, and crushing despair across continents. Germany was particularly vulnerable. Its economy was already strained by the harsh reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles and the lingering effects of hyperinflation. The nation's recovery depended heavily on loans from the United States under the Dawes and Young plans. When the US economy imploded, these vital loans abruptly stopped, plunging Germany into an even deeper abyss. By early 1933, over 6 million Germans, roughly 1/3 of the workforce, were unemployed. The social fabric strained to its breaking point. This economic devastation was a fertile ground for radical solutions. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party expertly seized the moment. They didn't just offer vague promises, they presented targeted solutions for every segment of society. To workers, they promised jobs and an end to exploitation. To the middle class and small business owners, they offered stability against both communism and big business, often blaming Jews for economic ills. To farmers, they pledged relief from debt. Their core message resonated: reject the hated Treaty of Versailles, restore national pride, and create a strong, unified Germany. The Nazi Party transformed from a fringe movement into a major political force with astonishing speed. While they garnered only a fraction of the vote in 1928, their support surged dramatically after 1929. By the July 1932 elections, they secured over 37% of the vote, becoming the largest party in Germany. This meteoric rise was fueled by public disillusionment with the mainstream Weimar parties, which seemed incapable of solving the crisis. The Nazis, in contrast, offered a decisive, albeit extreme alternative. They presented themselves as the only party capable of restoring order and national strength, masterfully exploiting the widespread fear and desperation. The Great Depression shattered Germany's fragile recovery, plunging millions into despair and disillusionment. In this climate, Hitler's promises of jobs, national pride, and strong leadership resonated profoundly. The Nazi Party surged in popularity, leading to intense political maneuvering that would ultimately place Adolf Hitler in the most powerful position in Germany, Chancellor. By the end of 1932, Hitler was in an unyielding position. He refused offers of vice-chancellorship, insisting only on the top job, Chancellor of Germany. He understood that true power lay at the pinnacle. President Paul von Hindenburg, however, was deeply reluctant. He famously disparaged Hitler as a Bohemian corporal and disliked his radicalism. Yet, a coalition of conservative elites, led by figures like Franz von Papen, underestimated Hitler. They believed they could use his popular support and his party's strength to dismantle the Weimar democracy and establish a more authoritarian regime, one they thought they could control. In a crucial backroom deal, von Papen convinced the aging Hindenburg that appointing Hitler as Chancellor, with himself as Vice-Chancellor, would stabilize the government. Just weeks later, on February the 27th, 1933, a pivotal event occurred. The Reichstag building, the very symbol of German democracy, went up in flames. The Nazis immediately declared it a communist plot, with Hermann Göring, then Prussian Interior Minister, leading this narrative. Without waiting for any real investigation, Hitler urged President Hindenburg to act. The very next day, February 28, 1933, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag fire decree. This was no mere emergency measure. It was the legal instrument that effectively dismantled democracy. Officially titled the Decree of the President of the Reich for the Protection of People and State, it suspended fundamental civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy. It granted the government sweeping emergency powers, allowing for the immediate arrest and detention of political opponents without trial. This decree was immediately weaponized, leading to the mass arrest of thousands of communists and socialists, silencing any effective opposition before the crucial March 1933 elections. The March elections were held in an atmosphere of intense repression. The Enabling Act, passed by the Reichstag on March 23, 1933, was the final nail in democracy's coffin. This act legally empowered Hitler's cabinet to pass laws without the Reichstag's consent for 4 years. It was the legal foundation for his dictatorship. In the months that followed, all other political parties were banned or dissolved. Trade unions were abolished, and Germany transformed into a totalitarian, one-party state. The apparatus of state terror expanded rapidly. The Gestapo, the secret state police, was established, employing vast networks of informers from ordinary citizens. This created an atmosphere of pervasive fear and paranoia, where speaking out against the regime carried extreme danger. Hitler had legally ascended to power, and through a swift, brutal consolidation, had effectively outlawed all opposition, forging his path to absolute control. Once in power, Hitler wasted no time in consolidating his grip and dismantling democracy, using events like the Reichstag fire to justify emergency decrees. With the legal framework of opposition dismantled, his focus turned outwards, systematically defying international treaties and sowing the seeds of racial persecution. Hitler's consolidation of power within Germany was matched by his increasing defiance of the international order. He systematically began to dismantle the Treaty of Versailles, a treaty that had been designed to prevent future conflict. In March 1935, he openly announced the establishment of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, directly violating the treaty's prohibition. Then, in March 1936, he took a bolder step, remilitarizing the Rhineland. German troops marched into this strategically vital demilitarized zone, directly challenging France and the security arrangements established after World War I. Britain and France, still deeply scarred by the First War and hesitant to confront Hitler, issued diplomatic protests but took no decisive action. This appeasement emboldened Hitler, proving he could violate the treaty with impunity. Internally, Hitler escalated his systematic persecution of Jews. In 1935, the infamous Nuremberg laws were introduced. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriages and any intimate relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans, aiming to prevent racial contamination. Simultaneously, the Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of their German citizenship, redefining them legally as mere subjects. This meant that people with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, regardless of their religious beliefs or how German they felt, were legally declared as belonging to a separate, inferior race, alienating them from their own country. These laws were not enacted in a vacuum. They were preceded and accompanied by relentless Nazi propaganda, amplified by publications like Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer. This propaganda systematically dehumanized Jews, portraying them as a threat to national health, economic stability, and racial purity. This created a climate where discrimination became normalized, and many Germans, either through genuine belief, fear of the Gestapo, or a desire to avoid becoming targets themselves, remained silent or compliant. Jews were increasingly excluded from public life, banned from parks, swimming pools, cinemas, and universities, leading to social ostracization and profound fear. The international community's reluctance to confront Hitler's violations, rooted in a desire to avoid war and an underestimation of his ultimate ambitions, allowed him to continue his aggressive agenda unchecked. Each unchecked defiance of the world order only solidified his power and paved the way for further aggression, setting Germany on a collision course with the rest of Europe. The escalating discrimination and violation of treaties reached a horrifying new crescendo in November 1938, with a violent pogrom that would shock the world, an event that marked a decisive step towards genocide. The situation escalated dramatically on November 7th, 1938. A 17-year-old Polish Jew named Herschel Grinspan, whose family had been brutally deported from Germany, shot and wounded Ernst vom Rath, a German diplomat in Paris. Vom Rath died 2 days later on November 9th. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, saw this tragic event as the perfect pretext. He masterfully orchestrated a narrative, presenting the pogrom that followed not as a state-sanctioned terror campaign, but as a spontaneous outpouring of public rage against the Jews, a reaction fueled by the assassination. However, this spontaneous uprising was in fact meticulously planned and coordinated by the Nazi Party leadership, with Hitler himself giving the go-ahead. What followed was a night of unprecedented state-sponsored terror. Across Germany and Austria, SS and SA units, alongside Hitler Youth and mobilized party members, unleashed widespread violence. Over 200 synagogues were burned or destroyed, and approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses were vandalized, looted, and smashed. The streets were littered with shattered glass, giving the event its chilling name, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Jewish homes were ransacked, and Jewish people were brutalized, beaten, and forced to witness the destruction of their property. While initial reports suggested around 91 direct deaths, the actual number of fatalities from violence, beatings, and subsequent arrests likely ran into the hundreds. The aftermath of Kristallnacht was equally brutal. Tens of thousands of Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, not as victims, but as perpetrators in the Nazi narrative, to be punished. In a particularly egregious act, the Nazi regime imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community as punishment for the assassination of von Rath. This further intensified the exclusion of Jews from all aspects of public life, deepening their isolation and fear. For Hitler, Kristallnacht was a vindication of his worldview. He was pleased that Goebbels could frame it as a popular uprising, further cementing the idea that the Jews were an alien enemy, provoking their own destruction. This horrific event was not just a spontaneous explosion of hate. It was a crucial step toward the final solution, a chilling demonstration of the Nazis' capacity for brutality and a stark warning to the world about their escalating persecution. The lack of decisive international intervention only served to confirm that Hitler could proceed with his genocidal agenda. Kristallnacht was a brutal preview of the atrocities to come, a clear sign that Hitler's ambitions knew no bounds and that appeasement had failed. The world watched as Germany, unchecked, continued its aggressive expansion, setting the stage for global conflict. Hitler's defiance of the world order escalated rapidly. In March 1938, he achieved the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, uniting all German-speaking peoples under one Reich, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. This move was met with little resistance, either from within Austria or from Britain and France, further emboldening Hitler. Then, in September 1938, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding the Sudetenland, a region with a significant German-speaking population. In a fateful meeting at Munich, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier agreed to Hitler's demands, hoping to avert war and believing Hitler's promise that this was his last territorial claim. However, Hitler had no intention of stopping. In March 1939, just months after the Munich Agreement, he shattered his promise and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, dismantling the nation. This act finally demonstrated the utter failure of the policy of appeasement. Britain and France, realizing their mistake and the true extent of Hitler's ambitions, finally issued a firm warning: any further aggression, particularly against Poland, would mean war. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Hitler set his sights on Poland, demanding the return of the Polish corridor and the city of Danzig. Crucially, in August 1939, Hitler secured a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This secretive agreement included protocols to divide Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence, effectively neutralizing the threat of a two-front war for Germany and giving Hitler a green light to invade Poland. On September 1, 1939, Hitler launched his invasion of Poland. For the first time, foreign leaders recognized the extent of Hitler's aggression. Germany unleashed the concept of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a devastating tactic combining fast-moving armored divisions with close air support to overwhelm enemy defenses with speed and shock. Within 6 weeks, Poland was crushed, its people suffering immense casualties. Hitler believed this war was necessary to achieve his vision of Lebensraum and restore Germany's dominance. While many Germans were reluctant to face another war, Hitler's propaganda had cultivated a sense of national grievance and a desire for restored prestige, making them more receptive to his aggressive foreign policy. The early months of the war were marked by spectacular German successes. As Blitzkrieg tactics proved devastatingly effective, first in Poland and then in the rapid conquest of Western Europe, including France. The invasion of Poland ignited World War II, a conflict driven by Hitler's expansionist aims and racial ideology. As the war raged, the Nazi regime secretly unleashed its most horrific plan: the systematic extermination of European Jewry, the horrifying realization of the final solution. While the world was engrossed in the escalating conflict, the Nazi regime, using the war as a cover, unleashed its most horrific atrocities in secret. The systematic persecution of Jews, which had begun with discrimination and segregation, evolved into a chilling policy of genocide. The final solution to the Jewish question, as the Nazis euphemizingly called it, was not an initial plan, but a program that escalated, particularly after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The mechanisms of murder were varied and terrifying. On the Eastern Front, mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen operated behind German lines. These SS and police units forced Jewish civilians and other targeted groups into mass shootings, often compelling victims to dig their own graves before execution. They murdered approximately 1.5 million Jews this way. Simultaneously, the Nazis established dedicated death or extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor. These were industrial-scale murder factories where millions were transported, often in cattle cars, subjected to horrifying selection processes, and then systematically murdered, predominantly by gassing with Zyklon B or carbon monoxide, followed by cremation. The scale of this genocide is staggering. Over approximately 4 years, the Nazis murdered around 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. But the Holocaust did not solely target Jews. Millions from other groups were also systematically persecuted and murdered, including Roma, Poles, and other Slavic peoples, Soviet POWs, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and political opponents. This was a highly organized bureaucratic enterprise involving a vast network of individuals in planning, execution, and logistical support. The Nazis maintained utmost secrecy around the extermination camps. While deportations and ghettoization were visible, the industrial-scale murder facilities were often hidden in remote areas of occupied Poland. Nevertheless, knowledge of deportations and mass killings did filter through. When Allied forces liberated the camps towards the end of the war, they were confronted with unimaginable horrors. The sheer scale of death and dehumanization. In a deliberate effort to ensure acknowledgement and prevent denial, Allied soldiers often forced local German civilians to witness the atrocities committed in their name. While the Holocaust unfolded in the shadows of war, the tide of the conflict itself began to turn on the brutal battlefields of the Eastern Front. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad marked a major turning point, signaling the beginning of the end for Hitler's war machine. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, opened a brutal, vast new front. Initially, German forces achieved lightning-fast victories, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and vast territories. Hitler and his generals had grossly underestimated the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, vast manpower reserves, and the sheer resilience of the Red Army and its people, expecting a swift collapse. However, the tide began to turn decisively at the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a crucial industrial city and a vital transport hub on the Volga River. Its capture was vital for Soviet logistics and a major prize for German prestige, especially as it bore Stalin's name. The battle that ensued became one of the most brutal and devastating in history. Fighting occurred street by street, house by house, in the frozen, ruined cityscape, resulting in immense casualties on both sides. In a masterful strategic maneuver known as Operation Uranus, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive in November 1942, encircling over 250,000 Axis soldiers, including the entire German 6th Army, within Stalingrad. Despite the dire situation, Hitler disastrously ordered his forces to hold their positions at all costs, refusing permission to break out, believing they could be resupplied by air, a plan that quickly proved impossible. The eventual surrender of Field Marshal Paulus and the remnants of the 6th Army in February 1943 marked a catastrophic defeat for Germany. Stalingrad was a pivotal turning point on the Eastern Front, marking the beginning of the long Soviet advance westward. Crucially, this immense defeat significantly eroded the myth of Hitler's invincibility. For the first time, many Germans began to doubt their leader and the war effort. The psychological blow was profound. Hitler's own mental state became increasingly detached. His fight-to-the-death mentality intensified, and he began blaming the German people for failing him. Exhibiting classic narcissistic thinking, While his cult of personality persisted due to fear and propaganda, Stalingrad revealed the fallibility of the Führer, sowing seeds of doubt that would ultimately contribute to his demise. Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility, and as the Allied forces relentlessly closed in from both east and west, the Nazi regime crumbled. The final days saw Hitler and his inner circle trapped in their bunker, facing the inevitable collapse of their regime and their ultimate demise. The impact of key battles like Stalingrad profoundly shapes the course of history. What other battles do you think were crucial turning points? Let us know in the comments. By early 1945, Germany was caught in a relentless vice. Allied forces from the west and the massive Soviet Red Army from the east were closing in. By January, Soviet troops had reached the Oder River, and in mid-April, they captured Vienna and fully encircled Berlin. The German capital was a city in ruins, pounded by Allied bombing raids and subjected to ferocious Soviet artillery bombardments. Life for civilians was reduced to surviving in cellars and bunkers. Adolf Hitler had retreated to the Führerbunker, an underground command center in Berlin. Here, isolated from the reality of the war, his physical and mental state deteriorated. He received fragmented reports, often sugar-coated or focused on minor tactical successes, as the Soviet forces relentlessly advanced. His world had shrunk to the confines of the bunker, a place where his frantic orders and psychological distress only deepened his detachment from the catastrophic reality unfolding around him. As the Soviet noose tightened, Hitler witnessed the grim fate of his ally. On April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini was captured and executed by Italian partisans. The gruesome public abuse of his corpse likely reinforced Hitler's determination to avoid capture at all costs. In his final hours, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in the bunker. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet artillery pounded the bunker above, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, shooting himself. Eva Braun took a cyanide capsule. Their bodies were then carried outside, doused in gasoline and burned. The same day, his propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, and his wife Magda, in an act of ultimate ideological devotion and twisted loyalty, murdered all 6 of their children before taking their own lives, unable to face a world without Hitler or the Nazi regime. The fall of Berlin was a brutal culmination of total war. Soviet troops fought fiercely through the ruined streets, committing widespread atrocities, including rape and looting, as revenge for German wartime actions. Fanatical Nazi elements attempted to enforce resistance even in the final chaotic moments. With Hitler and his inner circle dead and Berlin overrun, Germany's ability to resist collapsed. The formal surrender of all German armed forces would follow a week later, on May 8, 1945, marking Victory in Europe Day. The Führer was gone, but the dark stain of the Third Reich would remain etched in history forever. With the fall of Berlin and the death of Hitler, the war in Europe ended. But the end of the fighting brought with it the horrifying unraveling of the truth about the Holocaust. The question lingered: what did the German people truly know about the atrocities committed in their name? The question of what the German people truly knew about the horrors of the Holocaust is complex and deeply unsettling. While the Nazi regime enforced utmost secrecy around the extermination camps, knowledge of what was happening was not entirely absent. Many Germans knew that their Jewish compatriots were being rounded up, deported, and subjected to discrimination and violence. Word leaked out from escaped prisoners, soldiers returning from the front lines, and from the systematic persecution evident in daily life. By mid-war, Allied intelligence even possessed aerial photographs hinting at the scale of operations at camps like Auschwitz. Yet, Nazi propaganda worked tirelessly to misinform and desensitize the population. Deportations were often disguised as resettlement for labor, and the true nature of the final solution was meticulously hidden. Germans were also heavily preoccupied with their own wartime struggles, surviving Allied bombings, managing rationing, and the fate of their own soldiers. This preoccupation, combined with a pervasive climate of fear created by the Gestapo and a deep-seated anti-Semitism amplified by years of propaganda, meant that many chose willful ignorance or remain silent. Openly acknowledging or opposing Nazi crimes carried severe risks, leading to widespread passive complicity after the war. The common defense of "we didn't know" was often invoked, and for many, the precise details of the industrial-scale extermination remained obscure. However, the full extent of the atrocities was gradually revealed through Allied investigations, war crimes trials, and the testimony of survivors. The process of denazification aimed to purge Nazi influence, but the psychological impact of the regime lingered. Post-war polls revealed a disturbing residual affection for aspects of Nazism, particularly the idea that it had made Germany great again, highlighting the long and difficult struggle for the German people to fully confront and integrate the knowledge of what had been done in their name. The difficult process of confronting this truth, of denazification, and of remembering the victims continues to shape Germany and the world. The legacy of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich serves as a stark, eternal reminder of the depths of human capacity for evil and the critical importance of vigilance, truth, and remembrance. Modern Germany has evolved significantly, striving to confront its past and build a future based on democratic values and human rights. However, the actions of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party left deep, indelible scars on history. The story of the Third Reich serves as a profound and eternal reminder of the fragility of peace, the dangers of unchecked hatred, and the critical importance of vigilance in protecting human dignity and democratic freedoms. What are your thoughts on this pivotal period in history? How can we ensure such darkness never returns? Share your reflections in the comments below. And if you found this journey through history insightful, please subscribe for more stories that shape our understanding of the world.